Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to today's event. My name is Alexander Kay. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Northeastern University. It's a tremendous pleasure today to invite our guest, Emily Glick, who's an award-winning photographer and journalist who spent many years documenting events that have been happening in some specific Palestinian villages in the southern West Bank. I'm going to turn over to our conversation in just a minute, but let me sort of give a little bit of background to the events that Emily has been documenting these past years. The focus of our discussion today is going to be on the experiences of Palestinian communities in parts of the West Bank, in an area known as Area C, that are under the control of the IDF, the Israeli military. And these areas have been subject to a very high degree of violence, even more so in recent years. Now, there's been a lot of violence in the West Bank for many decades, which has included attacks by Palestinians upon Israeli military and civilian targets, and also by Jewish settlers and the Israeli military on Palestinian militias and civilians. But the degree of violence has increased in recent years, especially since the beginning of the war in Gaza, and Jewish attacks on Palestinians in particular have grown exponentially and now amount to many dozens of attacks each month, which include the burning of property, including mosques, homes, cars, businesses, and attacks with weapons of different kinds on communities, on elementary schools. And in more than one case, there's also been examples of just outright murder. There are a few causes for this increase in violence in recent times. Some of the Jews who are perpetrating these attacks on Palestinians say that they are engaging in essentially revenge attacks for the Hamas attacks of October 7th. But many of them are actually quite open about their intention to cause harm and fear among Palestinian communities, to cause them to leave their homes and allow Jewish settlers to take over their land. Now, I have to emphasize that the actions of the bands of mostly young, violent Jews who perpetrate most of these attacks are absolutely repudiated by most Israelis and indeed most Jewish settlers as well. But they have been given some support by religious leaders, by some religious leaders who have created a kind of new extremist apocalyptic theology to justify this violence. And they're also emboldened by the current Israeli government in certain ways, including the fact that senior members of the government have been very open about their desire to annex large areas of the West Bank. And there are certain specific policies as well. For example, the choice of the current Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, to ban the use of administrative detention against people who have perpetrated these kinds of violence, which has been actually criticized by the army itself. The incidence of violence is now so serious that it's being condemned from everybody from the IDF commander of the West Bank, who's called Avi Blut, or by Israel's chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, and even by the Trump administration. Marco Rubio, for example, recently expressed concern about the degree of Jewish violence. Now, today we're not going to focus on the political or historical aspects of these developments. And as I say, we're not going to focus today on Palestinian violence against Jews, something that we have covered in numerous other events over the past few months. We are focusing now on the human aspects of the violence against Palestinians in these communities. And we're delighted to have Emily Glick with us to talk about these things. And I want to just turn over now to a conversation with you. And I know you've brought a presentation and some of your images that you've taken in your photographic work. But why don't you start off, please, by sharing with us what drew you to this work? Why did you come to focus in your work as a photographic documenter on these communities in the southern West Bank?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. It's so nice to be here with all of you in this room and all of you on the screen. My name is Emily, obviously. I first moved to Jerusalem in 2019 to participate in a program called Achvad Amim, It's a learning fellowship where people are based in a cohort experience in Jerusalem and do work all over Israel and the West Bank with Israeli and Palestinian communities, learning about the conflict, the history, the people who live on the land. And I was drawn to this program because the title mission statement of the program is that we believe in dignity and freedom for all people in the place that they call home. And I think that I grew up in a Jewish home with I studied abroad in Haifa in my undergrad, and I studied social and political theory, and I was like trying to connect these like kind of disparate pieces of my learning, both my political learning in my undergraduate degree and also my learning as a person growing up in the US as a Jewish person. And when I got to this program, I started learning a lot more about Israelis and Palestinians and what life looks like on the ground. And I ended up staying and doing a master's in conflict resolution at Hebrew University, and getting very involved in a particular region of the West Bank called the South Hebron Hills. It's the rural lands, which are technically part of Area C in the West Bank, around the city of Hebron and the city of Yatta, that surrounding area. And this area, I got kind of pulled into work there because relationships have existed in this area, particularly more so than anywhere else in the West Bank, between Israelis, internationals, and Palestinians working together on building a different future in this land. And not just in a way that's like sitting and talking about what we want a different future to look like, but I found immediately in spending time there that these different groups were working together in a way that was like pushing the boundaries of the systems that were upholding the violence that I was witnessing around me. So the word that's used a lot in these circles is co-resistance versus coexistence. We're resisting against these unjust systems together, and that's our route to building a better future. So yeah, and particularly these, I was a young Jewish person coming into these villages in the West Bank, and I was able to feel pretty quickly comfortable there because there was this history of solidarity and trust and relationships that had been built over time. And it very quickly meant that my work there, I was running a project called the Storytelling Project that taught like media skills and narrative and how to write op-eds and how to tell your story to Palestinian youth living in this area. So I was working with a lot of different communities there on educational content of how do we tell the story of our lived reality when the media often doesn't reflect these parts.
I also know that you have images that you're able to show us.
Great. So this is the region that I'm talking about. On the left is the map of West Bank, and on the right is a zoomed in, kind of hard to see from here, but zoomed in of what the area of the South Hebron Hills looks like. In Arabic, it's called Masafar Yatta, the agricultural land around the city of Yatta. I don't think my clicker's working, but
try now because sometimes it. Okay.
Great. I'm just going to say a word about. Is this okay, or do you want? About documentation in the West Bank. Obviously, for like the first 2 decades of the 21st century, like is the case elsewhere in the world, including here, cameras really came on the scene, social media came on the scene. These technological developments really changed the pace of media. We all know that. And that was also the case in the West Bank. And I'm just going to briefly talk specifically about this one case in 2016 that maybe some people here remember, of Elor Azaria. In March 2016, he was a soldier stationed in Hebron, and he at close range, shot and killed a Palestinian man who's lying on the ground. And the entire thing was filmed by a photographer or videographer from B'Tselem, which is a Israeli human rights organization. And in this instance, I'm sure people in this room know about the history of this, but it really became in the article on the left, he is called the Man of the Year. He became a symbol of on really every side of the argument of like, okay, this was fully filmed. The evidence is here. This is what happened, and I think the left, or the Palestinians living in the West Bank and the Israeli left was like, okay, now we have evidence. This is the kind of violence that's happening. Now the world will finally see and believe. And it also was used as a tool of political interest also for Israeli mainstream society of we need to protect our soldiers in the West Bank, and now people will finally see all the violence that occurs, and this is so I think on all sides it was a moment of like, okay, documentation can now be used to tell our story and prove our point in a way that will not be disputable, and it'll help our political interests. So use of documentation all over the West Bank, but specifically in the area that I was working, was just really live. Everyone was constantly documenting. In this photo, there is a settler all the way to the right, two soldiers, obviously, and a Palestinian resident of the area, who was also holding his phone in his right hand. And everyone's filming each other. In this particular moment was there was a swath of private Palestinian farmland that the settler on the right started digging into with a bulldozer. The Palestinians called the police, and the police called the army, and everyone just immediately takes out their phones to document, this is what's happening, we're gonna tell the world. And of course, I'm standing there taking a photo of this, documenting the documentation happening.
Can we have the next slide, Freddie? The clicker's not doing great.
Another example, this was during a demolition of a home that was happening in a village called Tawani. The border patrol officer on the left is filming one of the women holding a phone, which you can't really see in this photo, but same kind of thing. Everyone is filming each other. So the question underneath is why? Why is the filming happening? And particularly, obviously, relevant for me, in the context of solidarity work and witnessing violence, why is documentation important and why is it useful? And I think this really distills in my head down to like two different categories. One theory is that documenting these scenes will interrupt the violence that's happening, or the violent systems that's happening. So similarly here, this is an Israeli activist who was documenting some illegal construction happening of an outpost that was being guarded by these soldiers. This is a resident of a village being arrested, and an Israeli activist filming it. So part of the hope here also is that there'll be some deterrence of violence, of, okay, this is being, they're watching, we won't be as harsh or violent, or, some sort of deterrence through accountability. And then there's also, of course, a hope that there'll be legal mechanisms that come in afterwards to, in a more formal court setting, holds, be a system of accountability for these injustices. Yeah.
And let me just ask you, Emily, because I know that you're personally working on questions of like journalistic ethics, and in these photographs we see everybody has a camera, and then there's you, sort of you're not there because it's your image. So how do you think of yourself? You've talked about your desire to engage in what you've called resistance and to interrupt systems of injustice in the way that you understand the situation. But also, you're also thinking of yourself as I don't know what words you would use, but essentially as an outsider. Like there are people holding phones. You're not one of them. You're like a separate kind of onlooker in a way, documenter. So how are you thinking of your role, both in terms of like your personal role in the situation, and I don't know if journalistic ethics apply here, if you think of this as journalism or as something else, storytelling or whatever else. Like how do you think about that?
Section on ethics that I will get to in a bit, but I think what was true and very unique about my experience working in the South Hebron Hills is that I was also in deep relationship with the people I was documenting. They were friends who I went to their birthday parties, and when they had new babies, and when there was a death in the family, I would come. Weddings, I would like go to their family simchas, and so in a pure journalistic integrity, the journalist is supposed to be unbiased. I was not. I had deep, caring relationships with the people I was working with here. And I really saw my role also as a voice for getting these stories out to the world in a way that was deeply centered in those relationships and the human experience, and also giving them, or in an ideal sense, or trying my best to help support them and having a platform to tell the story that they want to tell about their life, a story that gets so muddled through all sorts of different mechanisms that the media uses. And so I was I was both trying to be a conduit for that, and also trying to share through my own platforms the stories that I was witnessing and seeing there. This was just on the evidence front. This man was Palestinian man. Hafez was attacked in his garden by two settlers, and there happened to be a British man who was there on doing solidarity documentation work, and he happened to film the incident. And Hafez was attacked and then was arrested, which is something that often happens to Palestinians, that they are a victim of an attack and then they get arrested by the police. And he was able to get released from prison because of the documentation that this activist had recorded. So I would not say that's the norm in this system, but in his case in particular, he was released because of the footage was very clear of what had unfolded. And then the other, should I keep going?
Sure. Yeah. No, please go. You go for it. This is.
The other reason to document that I really feel strongly about is that to document some of the ways that violence happens that's less acute. In the news, we often see a murder or an attack, a terrorist attack, something that's very concrete that we can see. And the reality of a place that is both so rural and underrepresented in the media is a lot of things happen, and either the person doesn't have a phone, or they're alone and aren't able to document what happens, or their phone is taken away, or the footage is not doesn't go anywhere. So I ended up I ended up spending a lot of time documenting ruins. And I think that, I don't know, it's probably working. Okay. Well.
Sorry, we're having clear trouble. Thanks, Inbo.
Back one, yeah. One more back, other way. Yeah, this. This is Basil Adara, who the director of the film No Other Land, will also speak about later. But he was going the next morning after the settlers burned down this Palestinian home that thankfully no one was in at the time. But he was going to just look at the wreckage afterwards, and I joined him to go look at it. And similarly here, these are solar panels that settlers came into this village of Musagara to smash their solar panels. I went the next day to photograph them. There was no footage of the actual attack happening. And this is a man named Eid in the village of Khair, standing on the ruins of his home a few days after it was demolished by the military. And I stood there talking to him for a while, and as I was sitting there, he was kind of sifting through all of the pieces of his home, and I was asking him, like, why is he doing that? And he was like, well, I'm gonna rebuild it, and I have to like take the pieces that, the concrete blocks that are not fully broken, and so I can be able to rebuild them. And he rebuilt some sort of makeshift structure for his home, but actually just a few weeks ago, the army came back to give another demolition order, which is a whole, like, there's a lot underneath the political framework that Alex gave around the policies of living in Area C. But home demolitions is a key way that the army and the settlers do kind of what Alex was referring to, of like this underlying hope to clear Palestinians off of the land of Area C and consolidate them in larger cities in Area A.
Let me, before you continue with this, with the images, let me ask you, you've been talking about your interest in sort of creating a documentation, creating an archive, and I hear in that there's a desire in sort of having sort of unassailable evidence of a thing having happened. But we also know that people today, for good reason, are incredibly skeptical of any evidence, including photographic evidence. So, for example, in Israel in the October 7th attacks, there were just extremely clear video and photography evidence of the Hamas attacks that were just widely discredited by some kind of conspiracy theorists online. And similarly, the extremely extensive documentation of the Gaza war, for example, is often questioned and critiqued, and the validity of the photographs is questioned because of AI, and even before AI, people can stage photographs as all kinds of things. So I wonder, like, if your interest is in creating this kind of unassailable archive, how has that been going? Do you find that you've been effective in that, or is there just a kind of conspiracy theory mentality which is pervasive enough in society that it just makes it very difficult to do?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one, to be honest, I don't feel like I have the best answer for. It's obviously true. There's a world of conspiratorial content on all sides of the political spectrum, and AI is alive and well and growing, and these are like real questions that me as a photographer and like all of us have to contend with in consuming media content. I think one thing that's important is for us to be aware of and careful around what systems of fact checking we're using, and whose story is believed as a fact, whose photo, is the photo in the New York Times really legitimate, but the photo on um, this random person's social media not so legitimate. Does this person have access to like sharing their story in a place that's well read? When are facts legitimate is like really and photos a question that comes to mind for me. I know it's another part of the thing. Remember.
I have a feeling it will come up as you continue with these images. Was there more stuff that you wanted to show just now, or?
But this is a long-term project that I worked on for years, documenting scars, which to me is on people's bodies from different types of violence in the area. And I think that this to me is really the embodiment of slow violence, or a system that like is really changing a society over time through, there's obviously trauma underneath physical scars also, and this is, of course, so present in all of Israeli and Palestinian society. There are just like the physical and emotional toll of living under war and conflict for so many years is like, I think the Scars Project was meant to be an embodiment and tangible documentation of this ongoing slow violence of the region. he also was part of the Scars Project. He lost his hand in an incident. Okay, talk about some ethical concerns. Yeah, these two little vignettes are. I was documenting a demolition that was happening, and this woman was sitting there with her. I didn't know her. I had never been to the village before, and she was sitting there with her scarf over her face, and I was like, "Wow, this could be a really powerful photo." Like the juxtaposition between the soldiers and her facing that direction and covering her face. And I stood there for a while, like, this is like really the worst day of her life. Who am I here to go take this picture of her? Where am I going to put this picture? But like, I really want to take this picture. And yeah, there's just always that cost benefit weighing ethical, moral dilemma of when in this moment am I like, I don't think she noticed me. I was like far enough away, and she was obviously focused on the demolition of her home that was in front of her. But I obviously ended up deciding to take the photo, and to my knowledge, there wasn't a cost of doing that, but there could have been. That I've also had moments where people don't want their photograph taken and are very clear about that beforehand, or a moment I've taken a photo and I say, no, I don't know. Okay, like I'll delete it, or well, people should consent. But that's obviously, I'm not getting consent every time I'm photographing someone in these scenarios. And it is a very live and present question that's more or less me calculating a constant calculation of scenario. This was this is the same demolition on the other side of me. And then also, this was a funeral I attended of the man on the left. The picture on the right is of his funeral. And this was in Umucher, a village where there's some pretty intense gender segregation. And all the other photographers and the press who were there were men. And I was kind of trying to sneak around with the men who were parading the body to the funeral, to the burial. And then I went to sit with the women who I know and are close friends of mine. And a journalist friend of mine who's a man was like, you should go photograph the women because you can. And then I went to sit with the women, and they were all sobbing and in a really like emotional, tender moment. And I put my camera away. I was like, I am not gonna. It felt very clear to me in that moment that this was not me being a journalist, or that it was worth it for me to like intrude with my camera in this moment and document their grieving. And that what was more important for me to be present as a person. This was a question you had.
Talked about this. We talked about this beforehand, because you obviously have invested a huge amount of expertise, but also emotional energy, and you do have a goal behind your work. Have you found it to be effective?
Yeah. When Alex asked me this question, I was like, oh. Yeah, it's hard. I'm also not looking at time.
Wait, I'll take care of it. We're okay.
It's obviously a heavy and present question. But I'll say two things. One, this is an example of this is a project I did around a specific campaign. There was a big court case around this area in Masafriata. The court was declaring it a military training area. I was part of a group of people who worked hard to kind of publicize that these Palestinian villages have been in this area for a long time. It would be very destructive if the military was to use the land as a training ground. So I went to a bunch of the villages and took different portraits of people in their like life in their home. And then we printed these photos and put them all over Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa on the streets, with little blurbs about like who these people were and like what the photo was of or what was happening, and with like a hashtag and QR code to a site to get more information. And the court case passed. They declared it a firing zone. Like it was a loss in that sense. And when we set out to do this campaign, our goal was to make Masafriata like a household name, to get people to like have awareness about this swath of land and what was happening there. And I think that goal and like the educational side of things is like really hard to measure because it's over a very long period of time. There are like groups, different organizations and campaigns that have been going on for decades to raise awareness around some of these things. And like, I think that it was a win in some ways and also deeply not in others. But yeah, that like education is hard to measure for sure. And then No Other Land is the other big example I think to use here. I assume most people have heard of No Other Land, but that's not true. No Other Land won the Oscar earlier this year for Best Documentary. It was made by this collective of 4 directors, 2 Israelis and 2 Palestinians. And the film really documents a lot of what I have been describing here: life in Masafer Yatta, the fight against staying on the land that these people live on. And No Other Land, like, they made it to the Oscar and they won the Oscar. It was a really big deal when it happened. And 2 weeks later, Hamdan, who is the Palestinian man on the second to the right, was attacked in his home and arrested. And 2 days ago, Basil's father was arrested. I don't think any of them would say that the violence lessened in their lives after, if anything, it maybe grew after they made this film. And yeah, I think that on the point of education, of course, like more people know about Masafer Yatta, more people know about what's happening, and also the systems are powerful and going in the other direction than we want them to be going.
So we're gonna close our filming in just a minute, and I wanted to make sure that I got a chance to ask you this one last question, because here at the Schusterman Center, we have many kinds of events where we talk more specifically about the details of the politics and the legal aspects of all of this. You mentioned, the court case in 2022 determining this area as an army firing zone and so on. And we'll have other events and classes and so on where we talk about the kind of more technical, political, and legal aspects of this. And one of the reasons why I was very happy that you agreed to come and talk to us was because obviously you're an artist and a photographer, but your focus is on the human aspects of this situation, particularly in the villages that you're looking at. And at the same time, you're somebody that's very involved in the Jewish community. You've lived in Jerusalem for many, many years. You're somebody that's kind of like affiliated and has like deep personal friendships in I don't even want to use the word sides at the moment, but in different aspects of this very complex situation. And just in our closing moments, I wondered if there was anything from your experiences that you'd just like to bring as a message to people that may see this conversation.
I think that everything exists at the center of relationships, and the people that I like hearing from people and their lived experiences, there's nothing that replaces it. And I feel that way about all of my Palestinian and Israeli friends and my time living in Jerusalem. And I think that one message is like, talk to people who and believe their lived experiences. And I think that is really the only path forward, is to continue to struggle for a better future based in like real community and relationships across difference that we can cultivate. Yeah.
Emily, thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks everybody for participating in this conversation.